When we think of Noah's Ark, most of us picture the same thing, right? A big boat, a huge flood, animals marching two by two. But the chapter that actually kicks it all off, Genesis 6, tells a story that is way, way stranger and a lot more intense than the one we remember from childhood. So I want you to think about this for a second. What if the story wasn't really about the flood at all? What if it was about a world that was spiraling so far out of control for some very specific supernatural reasons? And this slide right here, this really gets to the heart of it. On the left, you've got the story we all know. But on the right, you have what the source text actually talks about: fallen angels, giants roaming the earth, and a level of corruption so absolute that it required a total reset. That's the rabbit hole we're going down today. So, first up, let's just look at what the text says before a single drop of rain falls. Because the story actually starts with a really bizarre situation taking place on Earth. This is where things get wild. Right at the beginning, the chapter throws two really mysterious groups at us: these sons of God and the Nephilim, who are straight up described as giants. And honestly, figuring out who these two groups are is the key to understanding why the flood was even on the table in the first place. Okay, so let's dig into how this strange situation just completely explodes into worldwide corruption. According to this interpretation, these events weren't just some weird side story. They were the actual trigger for humanity's downfall. So who exactly were these sons of God? Well, this view argues pretty strongly that the phrase doesn't mean human men at all. It's talking about celestial beings, specifically fallen angels who rebelled and came down to earth. And from there, you can just see the dominoes fall. This rebellion leads to unions with human women, which in turn creates these hybrid beings, the Nephilim giants. This interpretation also says that these fallen angels brought forbidden knowledge to humans, things like making advanced weapons and even pharmacology, which just poured gasoline on the fire of global corruption. And the results of all this? It was absolute. This quote from the text is just chilling. It wasn't just that people were doing bad things. It says the very inclination of every human heart was only evil all the time. The corruption was total. And that sets the stage for a pretty drastic solution. So in a world completely swallowed up by all this supernatural chaos and evil, how in the world did one man and his family get spared? This is where the whole story takes a really critical turn. The text draws this sharp contrast, right? You've got the violent, corrupt world on one hand, and then you have Noah, who's called righteous and blameless. Now, it's really easy to think, okay, he was saved because he was a good person. But this interpretation says, not so fast. That's part of the story for sure, but it's not the ultimate reason. The real kicker, the secret sauce, is hiding right here in this verse. But Noah found favor. That word, favor, which can also be translated as grace, is presented as the actual key. It wasn't something Noah earned. It was something he found. It was given to him. And this brings us to what is maybe the central argument of this entire interpretation, this incredible idea called grace. In fact, this concept is often presented as the single most unique idea that this belief system brought to the world's religions. There's this fantastic story that's often used to explain it. A bunch of experts on world religions were debating what makes Christianity unique. They talked about a god becoming human or resurrection, but for every idea, someone found a parallel in another ancient belief. Then, the author C.S. Lewis walks in late, hears the question, and just says, oh, that's easy. It's grace. So what is grace then? It's not a reward for good behavior. It's defined as totally unmerited, unearned favor. It's a gift you receive, not a wage you earned for a job well done. And in Noah's story, his righteousness is seen as a response to that grace, not the reason he got it. All right, so for our final section, let's tie this all together. From this point of view, the Ark isn't just a historical boat. The entire event is seen as this powerful symbol, like a foreshadowing, of a much bigger idea of salvation. Check out these parallels that are drawn between Noah and the figure of Yeshua, or Jesus. You've got Noah, a carpenter, who worked with wood to save people physically. Then Jesus, also called a carpenter, who was nailed to wood to offer spiritual salvation. Noah built one single door into the ark. Jesus is called the door. You see, this symbolism is absolutely central to this way of reading the story. And it doesn't stop there. Even the numbers have meaning. Exactly 8 people were saved on that ark. In this reading, the number 8 always points to a new beginning. Just like the 8th day is the first day of a new week. It symbolizes a total reset for the human race. So, what's the big takeaway? According to this interpretation, the story of the ark is a timeless symbol of salvation. It's presented as a call to action, an urgent plea for people to find their own ark by entering that door of grace before, as the story goes, it's shut for good. And that's where we'll leave it. It really leaves us with a fascinating question to chew on, doesn't it? Here we have a story that's thousands of years old, but when it's seen through this very specific lens of fallen angels and unearned grace, it's still a powerful framework for millions of people. It just makes you wonder, how do these ancient interpretations keep shaping and defining the way we see the world today?
Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we were doing a deep dive into, well, one of the most famous and, I think, misunderstood stories in the world, Genesis chapter 6. It's the prelude to the Great Flood. And if you think this is just a children's story about a man, a big boat, and some animals, you are missing the absolutely intense backstory. Our source material makes it really clear. This isn't just about the flood itself. It's about what made this cosmic reset necessary.
Exactly. It's about a world so deeply corrupted that the text says the Creator, God himself, actually lamented making humanity in the first place. His heart was broken.
So that's our mission today. We want to explore this ancient story as if you've never read a page of the Bible before.
Right. And we have the text of Genesis 6, of course, but we're also looking at 3 key discoveries for reflection from our sources. These connect the dots between the narrative itself, early Jewish literature, and some really big questions about spiritual conflict and salvation.
So we jump right in, and the scene is, it's a crisis. Humans are multiplying across the earth, but this growth is described as an increase of rebellion.
And it's not just about, external actions. The violence was rampant, yes, but the text goes deeper.
It says, everything people thought or imagined was always totally bad.
That's the chilling part, isn't it? It's not just that people were doing bad things. It's that the very source of human thought, the heart, it was polluted permanently.
And that really sets the stage for the inciting incident, the true crisis.
Yeah.
And it all hinges on one very short and, let's be honest, extremely controversial passage.
It really does. It says, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took as wives any of them they chose.
Okay, so that's the big question. Who or what are these sons of God? Our sources propose a very specific interpretation.
They do. And it's not just speculation. If you connect this phrase to how it's used elsewhere in the Old Testament, and you look at ancient Jewish texts like some found in the Dead Sea Scrolls,
you get a very clear picture.
Yes. The sources conclude these aren't just human kings or, some righteous lineage of men. They are identified as celestial beings or fallen angels, beings who deliberately rebelled against God.
So what we're talking about here is not just human sin getting worse and worse. This is a spiritual incursion. It's a cross-species event.
Precisely. And the result of these unions between celestial beings and human women, they produced what the text calls the Nephilim. These were hybrid beings, giants.
And that right there is discovery number 1 from our sources. The idea that there is a spiritual world of evil actively and physically trying to pervert humanity.
Right. It completely reframes the whole story. The ultimate problem wasn't just theft or murder. It was a fundamental corruption of what it means to be human.
And if you connect this to the bigger picture, it sort of lays the groundwork for this theme of spiritual conflict that you see throughout the rest of the scriptures.
It does. It helps explain that feeling we sometimes have that our struggles aren't just against, flesh and blood, as it says later, but against these unseen, malignant authorities of the invisible world.
So what was the immediate result of all this? What did God do?
He set a limit. Because of this corruption, this mingling of natures, God decreed that human lifespan would not go beyond 120 years.
That's a huge drop.
It is. It marks the end of those incredibly long-lived patriarchs you read about earlier in Genesis. It was an immediate judgment on this contamination.
Which brings us to, I think, the emotional core of the whole chapter. It says, the Lord lamented having created the human being. I mean, that's just an incredibly powerful, grief-stricken phrase.
It is. And the decision was made to erase the human race. And not just humans, but all life from the face of the earth.
A total reset.
A total reset was needed because the integrity of creation itself had failed. But then the entire story pivots on one single person.
But Noah found favor before the Lord. So if the whole world was corrupt, if every single thought was evil, What was so different about Noah? What made him the exception?
Well, our sources really dig into this. He's described as a just man, sure. But the critical word here is the Hebrew word tamim.
Tamim.
Yes. It means he was the only intact person on earth. The word can mean complete or perfect, but in this context, the sources argue it means not defective.
Okay, that feels really important for what comes next.
It's everything.
Yeah.
And it brings us to our third big discovery, the idea of a contamination reset. The corruption wasn't just moral. The sources argue it was genetic. It was ontological.
So when it says Noah was Tamim in his generations,
It means his lineage, his family line, had not been mixed with these fallen celestial beings. The whole point of the flood was to cleanse the world of the Nephilim and the corrupted human seed.
wow. So the reset was needed because the very blueprint of humanity was compromised, and Noah was the pure starting point for the new world.
He was the viable link, the unblemished anchor for the future. And so God makes a pact, a covenant with him to preserve that lineage and, of course, the animal kingdom.
Which brings us to the ark. And the instructions God gives they're incredibly specific, aren't they?
Oh, remarkably so. I mean, this was not some little boat. He's commanded to build a massive vessel from cypress wood and then seal it inside and out with pitch, total waterproofing.
And the size of it.
The dimensions are just staggering for that time, about 138 meters long, 23 meters wide, 14 meters high.
To put that in perspective for you, that's nearly 2 football fields long and about 5 stories high.
Exactly. It's a monumental architectural and engineering feat. It would have required an incredible amount of work, and more than that, just monumental faith.
And the design was purely for survival. 3 floors and just one small opening for light and air running along the top.
That was it. And the passengers were specified. Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, their wives, and then a male and female pair of every single species.
The scale of that is hard to even imagine. But let's circle back to why Noah was chosen. He said he was Tamim, or complete. But the sources really stress that he didn't earn this salvation.
And this is where the story shifts from, let's say, history to radical theology. This is our discovery number 2, grace.
The text just says he found favor. He didn't work for it. He didn't justify himself. He just found it.
And we have to pause on that because that idea, the idea of unearned favor, is so counterintuitive to how we operate as human beings.
Completely. We live in a world of transactions. You work, you get paid, you do good, you get a reward.
Right. We instinctively believe in merit. But grace, as it's introduced here, is God's favor being given totally free, without any human effort or justification.
There's that famous C.S. Lewis story our sources mention. He arrives late to a symposium, and they ask him what makes Christianity unique among all world religions.
And he doesn't give some long, complex answer. He just says grace. That's it. Because almost every other human code or philosophy is built on merit. This idea of unearned favor, it breaks that whole system.
So what does that mean in practice? How do the sources kind of flesh that out?
Well, they point to later writings, like from the Apostle Paul, who makes this contrast explicit. He says, look, if you work, your salary isn't a gift, it's something you've earned. But salvation, this favor, is a gift. It's given through faith to the undeserving.
And even our best efforts.
Even our best acts of justice, the prophet Isaiah says, are like dirty rags because we're just fundamentally flawed. So Noah's salvation wasn't a prize for being good. It was an unmerited gift to restart a world that had gone spiritually and biologically bankrupt.
That is a much deeper way to understand grace. It wasn't just a nice gesture, it was a necessary intervention. Okay, let's go back to the Nephilim for a second. The sources know that a modern listener might hear all this. Fallen angels, giants, and think it sounds like pure science fiction.
And that's a natural reaction for us. But we have to remember the original audience. When Moses was writing this down for the Israelites, they knew about giants. They were a real historical threat.
They end up fighting them later, right? Like Goliath.
Exactly. So the point of the story wasn't to convince some 21st century skeptic. It was to record their sacred history, which included these very real conflicts.
And the sources take this a step further with a pretty controversial idea about ancient history.
They do. They basically ask, how do you explain the evidence of seemingly superior intelligence in some ancient civilization?
Like what? What are they pointing to?
Things like building the pyramids or the incredible precision of the Mayan calendars, advanced knowledge of mining, metallurgy for weapons, even the use of herbs to create drugs.
And their theory is what?
They propose that this was angelical knowledge that was given to humanity by these corrupt celestial beings.
but not to help humanity advance.
No, the exact opposite. The source's interpretation is that this knowledge was given to help humanity destroy themselves.
So the corruption wasn't just biological, it was technological.
Yeah.
A self-destruct mechanism.
Yes. It moves the conflict from a one-time flood to an ongoing spiritual battle over the very destiny of humanity.
Which brings this ancient story right into the present. And that brings us to the symbolic connections between Noah and the ultimate expression of grace that the sources talk about, Yeshua, or Jesus.
There are some really powerful parallels. The most obvious one is wood. Noah was a builder, a carpenter with a hammer, constructing the ark.
And Yeshua was a carpenter who was ultimately hammered to wood.
Right. Noah builds with wood to bring salvation from the judgment. Yeshua is nailed to wood to become the salvation through the judgment.
And the door, that's the biggest one.
The door. Noah builds one single door into the ark. It is the only way in, the only path to safety. And Yeshua explicitly says, I am the door.
The ark was the one vehicle to get from the old corrupt world to the new clean one.
And those 8 people who were saved, Noah, his wife, their 3 sons, and their wives, it's more than just repopulation. It symbolizes a new beginning.
The 8th day.
Exactly. The resurrection happened on the first day of the new week, which is the 8th day. It symbolizes a new spiritual creation, a new opportunity for humanity.
So, if Noah's world was judged for its violence, its impurity, its spiritual rebellion, what's the takeaway for us today?
Well, the sources draw a very direct parallel. We are living in times that are strikingly similar to those of Noah. You see the same kind of corruption, violence, deep moral conflict.
But grace is still available.
Grace is still available, and so the call isn't to panic, it's to act. We're called to build an ark of salvation for ourselves and for our families.
And there's a warning in there, too, about not taking that grace for granted.
Yes, the sources point to Methuselah, the oldest man. His life was, symbolically, the measure of God's patience. The year he died, the flood came. We're reminded not to test that patience.
The invitation is to enter through the door of salvation, which the sources identify as Yeshua, just like Noah and his family entered the ark. The whole story of humanity continues, not because we're perfect, but purely by that divine grace.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought. There's an old saying, he who saves a life saves the whole world. So if you look around at our world today, with all the conflict and wickedness that so closely mirrors Noah's time, what small ark of salvation, maybe it's spiritual or moral or just practical, what ark are you being called to build for your family or your community, knowing that grace is here right now, but also knowing that divine patience has a limit?
That is a profound challenge, linking this ancient story directly to our lives today. Thank you for guiding us through this incredible deep dive into Genesis 6, the Nephilim, and the radical gift of grace. We really encourage you to go and explore the source material for yourself.